Welcome, dear friends, to a quiet corner of the forest where mice, hedgehogs, and squirrels share gentle days and little adventures. Pour yourself a warm cup of tea, settle in, and let's wander together into the cozy world of woodland tales. Under the Willowmere Oak. The oak at Willowmere stood taller than any roof in the hollow, its crown spreading wide enough to shelter a dozen nests and burrows. Beneath its shade, the lanes of the little settlement curled in neat loops, dotted with mossy cottages and tiny gardens edged by low stone walls. At the bend of Alder Lane, an old wooden gate leaned across the path. It belonged to Mrs. Pine's garden. She was a hedgehog of practical habits, fond of her beans and roses. The gate, however, had seen better days. It swelled when it rained, sagged when it dried, and often stuck so stubbornly that no creature could pass through without a shove and a mutter. One drizzly morning, Hazel the field mouse was carrying a basket of clean linens back from the brook when she came upon Wren, the young squirrel who had only lately moved into the hollow. Wren stood before the gate, paws braced against the wood, pushing with all their might. It gave not an inch. Hazel set down her basket and chuckled. She's a stubborn one, that gate. You won't win by force. I've tried pushing, Wren admitted, panting, and pulling, and some kicking. They looked sheepishly at the muddy paw prints. Mrs. Pine says it needs a gentler touch, Hazel said. She showed them how to lift the latch, just so, raise the gate slightly on its hinge, then lean with the shoulder instead of the paws. With a groan of protest, the gate swung inward. Wren's eyes widened. That's a trick. Every old thing has its way, Hazel said, smiling. Even gates. The two of them passed through to Mrs. Pine's garden, where rows of beans shone with raindrops and the roses bent their heads under the weight of the wet. Mrs. Pine herself was bent too, tugging weeds with quiet determination. She looked up and scolded, "Don't slam the gate." Hazel and Wren exchanged guilty glances though they had done no slamming. They helped her with the weeds instead, Wren learning quickly which plants to leave and which to pluck. By the time the drizzle had passed, the garden looked tidy, and Mrs. Pine's mood softened enough for her to hand them each a radish, crisp and pink. On their way home, Wren said, "I thought I'd break that gate before I'd open it, but you just a lift and a lean." Hazel laughed. It's not strength that matters with old things, only patience. And so the stuck gate became a little lesson, one that Wren would remember each time they passed Alder Lane, lifting the latch with the practiced ease of a true neighbor of Willowmere. The following week brought clear skies and sharp winds. Smoke from the cottages rose in pale ribbons, carrying the smell of wood and peat across the hollow. At Bramble the badger's home, however, no smoke rose at all. Hazel noticed it first when she carried bread down Willowmere Lane. Bramble was at his doorway, sniffling miserably. "Fire won't draw," he grumbled. Smoke pours back into the room. "Can't boil a kettle without coughing." "Your chimney must be choked," Hazel said. "Clogged with last winter's soot, more like," Bramble admitted. "Meant to clean it weeks ago, but my back's been stiff." Hazel went off to find Wren, who, ever eager to help, bounded over with bright eyes. "I've climbed taller trees than chimneys," they declared. Together, the three of them fetched brushes, ropes, and a small iron weight from Clover the Mole's shed. Wren clambered up Bramble's roof, tail flicking for balance, while Hazel guided the brush from below. With much coughing, sneezing, and a shower of black soot, the chimney was finally cleared. When Wren came down, their fur dusted charcoal gray. Bramble laughed so heartily that Hazel feared he'd topple. "You look like a chimney yourself," he wheezed. Hazel dusted Wren off as best she could, though the squirrel only grinned. "Worth it. You'll have your kettle boiling in no time." And indeed, soon Bramble's hearth roared again, filling the cottage with warmth and the smell of strong tea. He pressed mugs into their paws, muttering his thanks. As they sat together, Hazel thought how everyday troubles, stuck gates, smoky chimneys, were hardly adventures at all, yet in Willowmere, such tasks seemed to knit neighbors closer than any grand occasion. It was a mild afternoon when Hazel sat at her window, sewing a patch on her apron. The breeze brought the smell of damp earth and violets, and somewhere a blackbird sang. But when she reached for her thimble, it was gone. She searched high and low, lifting cushions, peering under chairs, checking her basket twice. The thimble had vanished. "I can't mend without it," she sighed. Wren, passing by, heard her distress and offered to help. "Where did you last see it?" Hazel frowned. "By the brook, perhaps. I was darning socks there yesterday." So off they went, following the path past the alder trees to the brookside stones. Wren scrambled nimbly along the bank, while Hazel sifted through leaves. At last, Wren spotted a gleam between two stones in the shallows. "There!" they cried, reaching down. But the stone was slippery, and with a squeak they slid into the brook, water splashing high. Hazel gasped, then burst into laughter at the sight of Wren dripping and triumphant, the thimble clutched in their paw. They returned to Hazel's cottage, Wren wrapped in a towel, the thimble shining once more. Hazel set it on the windowsill with reverence. Strange how a little thing can feel like treasure when you lose it, and an adventure when you find it, Wren added, still damp but smiling. Hazel stitched her apron at last, each thread steady beneath the rescued thimble, while outside, the hollow settled into the soft hush of evening. The morning began with soft lights spilling over Willowmere, but by midday the sky darkened with a brooding heaviness. Hazel had been asked by Mrs. Pine to fetch flour from the miller's barn, a short walk along the alder-lined path that bordered the brook. "Don't tarry," Mrs. Pine warned, "or you'll be drenched." Hazel had meant to ask Wren to join her, but the squirrel was busy helping Bramble stack firewood, so she set off alone, baskets swinging at her side. By the time she reached the miller's, clouds had gathered thick as wool. She hurried, tucking the bag of flour in her basket, but the rain began before she had gone 10 paces down the lane. At first it was a drizzle, pattering gently against leaves, but soon sheets of rain came rushing down, soaking her cloak. Hazel darted toward a nearby shed, the abandoned tool house where Clover once kept spades and hoes, and ducked inside. Inside it was dim, smelling of damp wood and rusted iron. Hazel settled her basket safely on a shelf and wrung her cloak, sighing. She had no choice but to wait. Moments later, the door creaked again, and in tumbled Wren, dripping wet, fur plastered in spikes. "I was halfway home when the sky split open," they said, shaking themselves like a dog. Hazel laughed at the sight. "Well, we'll be here until it eases," she said, pulling them to sit beside her. Together, they listened to the drumming rain on the roof. At first, they talked of small things, the stubborn gate, Bramble's kettle, the rescued thimble. But as the rain poured on, silence fell, and Hazel felt strangely peaceful. When the storm finally passed, the sky brightened, and water dripped like silver threads from every branch. They stepped outside, the air smelling of earth and rain. The brook ran high, foaming against the stones, and little rivulets trickled across the lane. Hazel felt light, almost as though the storm had washed some heaviness away. Carrying the flour, they walked home together, their pace unhurried. Wren glanced at Hazel and said, "Funny how we find each other in every muddle." Hazel smiled. Perhaps that's what neighbors are for. And in that simple walk, through puddles and sunlight, the hollow itself seemed to breathe in relief. The rain left behind a world bright and fresh, but also troublesome for some. At the miller's barn, where Hazel had fetched flour, the roof had leaked dreadfully. Puddles spread across the floor, dampening sacks of grain. News of the mishap spread quickly, and by morning a small company had gathered to help. Hazel with her needle and strong thread, Wren with Bramwell's hammer, and Clover with her clever paws for patching holes. The miller, an old hare with spectacles perched on his nose, wrung his paws anxiously. If the sacks boil, I've nothing to grind. First they hauled the dampest sacks to drier corners. Wren scrambled up the rafters with admirable energy, patching tiles while Clover passed up nails. Hazel mended the torn sacking, her thimble clicking steadily. Bramwell fetched dry straw to lay her beneath. At one point, Wren slipped on the rafters, sending a small shower of dust and grain downward. Hazel gasped, but they caught themselves, tail flicking to balance. Nearly became flour myself, they joked. The hare chuckled nervously, though Hazel scolded. One day, you'll land head first in a sack, and we'll never find you. By the afternoon, the barn was steadied. Damp sacks were propped to dry, the roof patched against further rain. The hare poured them each a mug of weak but warming cider, his eyes grateful behind his spectacles. Couldn't have done it without you. The hollow always was a place where neighbors mattered. On the walk back, Hazel reflected that it was true. None of them alone could have saved the mill's stores, but together, even a leaky roof and sodden flour had been set right. And though her paws ached, the sense of shared purpose warmed her more than the cider had. After the work at the mill, Hazel thought an early rest would be her reward. But as evening fell, Bramwell came to her door with an unusual request. Lanterns, he said. Mina's correct. Wren's too. Could you spare a hand? It turned out several of the hollow's lanterns had fared poorly in the rainstorm. Wick glass clouded, hinges rusted, oil spilled. Without them, the lanes were dark and treacherous at night, especially with puddles and slick stones. So once again, neighbors gathered. This time it was Hazel's cozy cottage that became the workshop. On her table spread scraps of tin, wire, and glass. Clover polished, Bramwell tightened, Wren bent wire frames with nimble paws, and Hazel stitched new wicks. The cottage rang with quiet clinks and laughter. Pip and Lark, too small to be trusted with tools, waxed the lantern bases until they shone. They took great pride in holding each finished lantern aloft to test its glow. At last, as night deepened, they lit the lanterns and carried them out. One by one, they hung them along the lanes, soft golden lights glowing against the damp dark. The puddles reflected their shimmer like pools of starlight. Hazel stood with Wren beneath the great oak, watching the gentle sway of light. The hollow looks warmer for it, she murmured. Wren nodded, lantern light gleaming in their eyes. Even storms can't leave us in the dark, it seems. And there, beneath the oak of Willowmere, the neighbors shared a quiet moment. Not a festival, nor a grand affair. Only the steady glow of lanterns, the hush of a drying world, and the comfort of knowing that even after rain, there would always be light to guide them home. After the storm that had left the mill roof leaking and the lanterns dimmed, the brook still ran fast and high. Usually, its waters trickled gently under Alder Bridge, a small wooden span that linked the hollow to the meadows beyond. Children often dawdled there, tossing sticks into the current, while elders leaned against the rails and watched dragonflies dart. But one breezy morning, Clover the Mole discovered the bridge was not quite where it ought to be. Hazel was hanging her linens to dry when Clover hurried up, whiskers twitching. The bridge, she huffed, slipped from its post. One side floats free, dangerous as anything. Hazel set her basket down with a frown. The bridge had stood for decades, built by Bramwell's father with oak beams hauled from the forest edge. It had weathered floods before, but perhaps the storm had loosened its stones. By the time Hazel and Clover reached the brook, they found a small gathering. Bramwell, already inspecting the footings, misses. Pine, tooting anxiously, and Wren, who was hopping from stone to stone trying to see the damage from every angle. Indeed, the far end of the bridge had slipped loose, its wooden slats tilting down into the rushing water. Each wave slapped the beams, pulling them farther askew. "We'll lose it if we don't act," Bramble muttered. He prodded the timbers with his heavy paw. "Needs lifting and setting back. But the current's strong." "I'll climb down," Wren offered at once. "Tie a rope to me. I can wedge the beams straight." Mrs. Pine gasped. "You'll be swept away." Hazel's heart clenched, but she knew Wren's courage often outpaced their caution. "We'll all help," she said firmly. "Not just you." And so it began. Bramble fetched ropes from his shed. Clover dug stones from the bank to brace the footings. Hazel and Mrs. Pine tied the ropes fast around the oak tree near the path. Wren, nimble as ever, slid down to the water's edge, gripping the slick beam with both paws. The brook surged against them, spattering fur and cloak, but Wren held fast while Bramble hauled on the rope to lift the bridge upright. "Steady," Hazel called, guiding them with sharp eyes. "Higher, now hold." For a breathless moment, the beam tottered, water roaring beneath, until Clover wedged her stones into place and the footing caught. With one last shove, Bramble heaved the beam back onto its post. The bridge settled with a satisfying groan. Everyone let out a cheer. Wren clambered back up, dripping wet but grinning broadly. Hazel scolded through her relief. "One day, you'll give us all heart failure." That evening, Bramble lit a small fire by the brook so they could dry themselves. They sat together, tired but proud, as the repaired bridge stretched sturdy across the water once more. The dragonflies returned, skimming the surface as if nothing had happened. Yet Hazel, watching the lantern glow against the water, felt the day had strengthened something unseen. Like beams and stones that held not just bridges, but the hollow itself. Life in Willowmere had its rhythms. Bramble's steady chopping of firewood, Mrs. Pine's roses nodding in the morning breeze, Hazel's linens fluttering from her line. But nothing was quite as constant or as welcome as the smell of fresh bread drifting from Tansy the Vole's bakery. Her oven never seemed to rest. Buns for breakfast, loaves for supper, cakes for birthdays, though birthdays were modest affairs. She measured, kneaded, and dusted with flour until her whiskers gleamed white. Every hollow creature depended on her, though she never boasted. It was on a bright morning, with the air still cool from the night, that Hazel found Tansy flustered. She stood in her doorway, paws on her headscarf, sighing over 2 baskets. "Disaster," she muttered. "What is it?" Hazel asked, setting down her own small jar of honey meant for trade. "I've mixed the orders." Tansy groaned. "Mrs. Pine's currant buns went to Bramble, Bramble's seed loaf went to Clover, and Clover's oatcakes. Oh, I don't even know where they are." Hazel chuckled gently. "That's hardly disaster. We'll set it right." Soon Wren bounded in, sniffing eagerly at the air. Hazel explained the muddle, and Wren laughed. "Sounds like an excuse to visit everyone. I'll carry half." And so began the great bakery shuffle of Willowmere. Hazel and Wren tramped from door to door, swapping loaves, explaining, laughing at each mistaken delivery. Bramble, caught munching currant buns, only shrugged. "Not what I ordered, but not bad either." Mrs. Pine sniffed, insisting seed loaves upset her digestion, while Clover was found nibbling happily at Bramble's portion. Each exchange became merrier than the last, and by the time Hazel and Wren had restored every order, their basket was nearly empty and their hearts full. Back at the bakery, Tansy fretted, but Hazel reassured her. "No harm done. In fact, I think you gave the Hollow a story to tell." Wren added, "and a chance for us to walk off all this bread we've been sampling." They patted their belly with exaggerated seriousness, making Tansy laugh despite herself. That evening, as the Hollow dined on proper loaves and cakes, the air seemed filled not only with the scent of bread, but with something warmer. The reminder that mistakes, too, could be stitched into the fabric of neighborly life. It was in the following days that news reached Willowmere of a small worry. Little Timothy Prickle, Mrs. Pine's youngest nephew, had not returned from his morning ramble. Hedgehogs were fond of wandering, but Timothy was barely past his first winter. Mrs. Pine was beside herself, fussing in her garden. Said he'd fetch me rose petals, the silly boy. I told him not to dawdle by the brook. What if he's tumbled in? Hazel soothed her, promising they'd find him. Wren was already at her side, eager to search. Together with Clover, they set off along the familiar lanes, calling Timothy's name. The brook, mercifully, showed no sign of mishap. They followed instead the meadow path, where buttercups swayed and bees hummed. At last, faint snuffling reached their ears. Beneath a wild tangle of nettles, they found Timothy, covered in pollen, paws full of petals, and entirely unconcerned. "Timothy," Hazel cried, half in relief, half in exasperation. "Do you know the fright you've given your aunt?" Timothy blinked, then proudly presented a pawful of crushed petals. "For her roses," he explained. Wren scooped him up before Hazel could scold further, balancing the prickly youngster on their shoulder. "Come along, hero. Let's get you home." Back at Mrs. Pine's, Timothy was delivered safe, though she scolded him soundly before crushing him in a tearful hug. She pressed sweet tea into Hazel and Wren's paws, muttering thanks through her sniffles. When they left, Hazel sighed. "These lucky nettles don't sting hedgehogs." Wren grinned. Perhaps all wanderers need a nettle patch now and then to teach them when to turn back. Hazel thought of Wren's own wandering past, how the squirrel had once been new and rootless here. Yet already, Wren had become part of every errand, every muddle, every rescue. The hollow had claimed them, as surely as the oak's roots claimed the soil. And as the lanterns glimmered along the lanes that evening, Hazel felt that Willowmere's strength lay not in the great oak alone, but in the countless small threads of daily life. Threads that bound them tighter with every shared task, every worry soothed, every laugh exchanged. Hazel was sewing by the light of her window when Bramwell lumbered up the lane, squinting in a most unusual way. The badger was known for his sharp eyes when inspecting timbers or measuring roof beams, so Hazel set her needle aside with concern. "Trouble?" she asked as he paused at her gate. "Lost in Brunville, grumbled. My spectacles. Can't see my paw in front of my nose without him. Must have slipped clean off while I was hauling shingles yesterday." Hazel tilted her head. "And where exactly were you hauling shingles?" Bramwell scratched his chin. "Could have been at the mill, or near the brook, or maybe by Tansy's bakery, since I fetched bread afterward." He looked embarrassed. Somewhere in all that walking, Wren, who had been perched on Hazel's fence post, swung their tail with delight. "A treasure hunt, then? Come on. Hazel will retrace his steps." So the three of them set out, Bramwell squinting heavily, Hazel scanning the ground, and Wren bounding ahead like a detective. At the mill, they asked old Thistle, the water vole, if he'd seen anything. Thistle shook his head. Plenty of shingles, no spectacles. They combed the grass, but found only a rusty nail and a beetle scurrying under leaves. Next, the brook. Hazel bent close to the water's edge, the sun flashing on the ripples. Wren waded in up to their ankles, pretending to be a diver. "If I don't resurface, Hazel, tell Tansy I loved her honey tarts." Hazel swatted them with a laugh. Still no spectacles. Finally, they trudged to Tansy's bakery. The smell of rising loaves met them, warm and comforting. Tansy welcomed them with a flowery smile and pointed to a chair. "He left them there yesterday when he came in for a loaf. I told him not to forget, but," she shook her head fondly. There the spectacles sat, perched neatly on the chair's backrest, as though waiting patiently all along. Bramwell groaned in relief, slipping them onto his nose. World sharper already. Stars above, I'm blind without these. Hazel chuckled. Perhaps tie a string round your neck, Bramble. Spectacles are no good if they go wandering. Wren added with a sly grin. Or perhaps they were teaching you to ask for help now and then. Bramble harumphed, but his eyes twinkled behind the lenses. They left the bakery with bread tucked under one arm and a good story under the other. Hazel thinking all the while that even the smallest mishap became a kind of thread, weaving neighbors tighter together. The hollow's paths were well worn by daily pause. The lane to the mill, the track to the meadow, the narrow trail through the thickets. But one morning, Clover complained that the northern path, the one leading to her favorite mushroom patch, had grown nearly impassable. Thorns everywhere, she grumbled to Hazel over tea. Tore my sleeve clean through. Needs clearing, or else it'll vanish entirely. Hazel agreed. Paths were the veins of the hollow. Left untended, they tangled shut. She suggested a clearing party, and soon word spread. That afternoon, a small troop set out. Hazel with her shears, Clover with a stout spade, Bramble carrying an axe for heavier branches, and Wren balancing a basket on their back filled with lemonade and biscuits for later. The northern path proved worse than expected. Blackberry canes arched thick across it, snagging fur and clothes. Nettles towered shoulder high, and fallen branches tangled the way. Looks like the forest tried to take it back, Wren said, tugging at a thorny stem. They worked steadily, snipping, chopping, dragging brush aside. Clover cleared nettles with her spade, humming all the while. Bramble's axe rang through the air as he split a rotted log that blocked the trail. Hazel directed, sharp-eyed, making sure no one left a thorn to snag a future traveler. By midday, paws ached and fur was scratched, but the path began to show its shape again. They paused to drink Wren's lemonade, sitting on a fallen log, listening to birds call from the treetops. As they rested, Hazel thought of how paths mirrored friendships. Easy to let them grow over if not tended, but with steady care, they opened wide again, guiding all who walked them. When the last of the thorns were cleared and the sun slanted low, the path lay open and bright, leading on toward Clover's mushroom patch. She clapped her paws in delight. Clear as day again, and we've enough brush for kindling all season. They returned to the hollow scratched, but smiling. Wren carrying the empty basket now filled instead with bundles of blackberry canes. Hazel knew that in the weeks ahead, jam pots would bubble in many kitchens, sweet reward for a day's hard work. It was just as Hazel was settling down to supper that evening when a knock rattled her door. She opened it to find a stranger, a young stoat, cloak dripping with rain, eyes wide with travel. "Beg pardon," he said softly. "I've lost my way. I was bound for the river crossing, but the storm turned me around." Hazel blinked. Strangers were rare in Willowmere. Yet the stoat looked weary, not threatening, and his cloak was indeed sodden. She ushered him in without hesitation. "Sit by the fire. I'll fetch a towel." Soon the stoat was warming himself, steam rising from his cloak. Hazel served him stew, and he ate gratefully. His name was Lark, he said, and he was apprenticed to a trader in the far village. He'd been sent with a parcel of herbs, but the flooded brook had swept him off the main road. By the time Hazel led him to Brambles to seek a dry bed for the night, half the hollow had gathered, curious about the guest. Wren, of course, was first with questions. "What's it like beyond the meadow? Do they bake currant buns there too?" Lark laughed shyly, describing markets filled with spices, lanterns hung high in the square, boats that ferried goods up and down the river. The hollow listened wide-eyed, as if he were describing another world. When at last he settled in Bramble's spare room, Hazel felt a quiet thrill. For all their love of everyday rhythms, sometimes the world reached in unexpectedly, bringing with it stories and possibilities beyond their oak. That night, As rain pattered against her shutters, Hazel lay awake, wondering. Perhaps Willowmere was not so small after all. Perhaps every brook and path, every wandering guest, was a thread that tied them not just to one another, but to the wide world beyond. Morning dawned with the air fresh and washed clean, as though the storm had scoured every leaf and twig. Hazel rose early, as was her habit, and found herself thinking of their guest, young Lark. She had promised to see him again today, to ensure his parcel of herbs was still safe after the soaking heat endured. When she knocked at Bramwell's door, the stoat answered looking better rested, his eyes less shadowed. Bramwell appeared behind him, scratching his striped head. "He's eaten half my larder," the badger complained, though not without fondness. "Growing lads?" Lark laughed sheepishly and produced the small parcel, neatly wrapped in waxed paper and tied with twine. "Still dry, thanks to the oilskin," he said, "but the storm left me far off course. I was meant to deliver this 3 days ago." Hazel examined the parcel curiously. The faint smell of rosemary and dried sage wafted through the paper. "Were they for?" she asked. "A healer in the river village ordered them," Lark explained. "She brews tonics for fevers and winter coughs. My master trades in such things." The hollow had its own remedies. Hazel bark for toothache, elderberry syrup for colds. But Hazel was intrigued by the notion of parcels and orders, of trade weaving villages together. Still, she could see the worry in Lark's eyes. "You not get far on empty stomach," Hazel said briskly. "Come along. If you mean to reach the river path, we'll see you provisioned." So began a day of preparation. Clover filled a basket with oat cakes and dried apples for the road. Bramwell insisted on giving him a stout walking stick. Wren, mischievous as always, tucked in a small sprig of mint. For luck, they said. As Lark accepted each gift, Hazel watched the hollow at work, neighbors stepping forward not out of duty, but from kindness. It warmed her. By the afternoon, the stoat was ready to set off. Yet clouds threatened again, and Hazel urged caution. "Best wait for morning," she advised. "The forest kinder when you can see your way." So Lark agreed, and once more found a bed at Bramwell's. That night, Hazel thought of the parcel of herbs, so small and ordinary, yet somehow a thread linking their quiet hollow to lives far beyond. If Hazel was practical, Wren was restless. The squirrel could not leave well enough alone. The presence of a stranger stirred every question in their mind. They cornered Lark after breakfast, peppering him with queries. How big are the boats on the river? Do folk wear hats? Do they have bakers finer than Tansy? Lark laughed, trying to answer as best he could. Boats big enough to carry barrels, though none so big as to hold the whole meadow. Hats, yes, broad-brimmed, to keep off rain. As for bakers, he leaned closer, conspiratorial. None bake as sweet as Tansy, I promise. That flattered Tansy, so that she pressed another tart into his paw. But Wren's questions turned bolder. Have you ever thought to leave your village for good? To wander? To see what lies beyond the river? Hazel, overhearing, scolded gently. Not all are made for wandering. Some roots run deeper. Yet Wren's eyes sparkled, and Hazel could not deny she felt a stir herself. The hollow was dear, but wasn't it curious, too, how little they knew of the wider world? That afternoon, Wren proposed an outing. If Lark means to set off tomorrow, we'll guide him as far as the bend in the brook. Let him see how we travel our own ways. Hazel hesitated, but Bramwell agreed, saying it was sensible to be sure the stoat did not lose himself again. So they went, a merry little band, walking through meadows fragrant with clover along paths still damp from storm. Lark marveled at how carefully the hollow tended its lanes, how lanterns hung even in shaded beds. "Your home is gentler than most," he remarked. "Where I come from, folk hurry. Trade, work, and little time for talk." Hazel smiled faintly. "Here, talk is part of the work. At the brook, they rested, sharing oatcakes. Wren showed him how to leap the stepping stones without soaking his tail, though of course they slipped in on purpose, to everyone's laughter. Lark's face, so tense upon arrival, eased into genuine warmth. As dusk neared, they turned back. Hazel thought she saw a shadow in Wren's gaze, some longing or wondering. Perhaps Lark's presence had stirred more than curiosity. It had stirred the thought that the hollow, dear as it was but one corner of the forest. The morning of Lark's departure came with a hush over the hollow. Mist clung low to the fields, silvering the grasses. Hazel was already up, bread baking, when a knock came at her door. It was Lark, bundle strapped, walking stick in paw. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply, "for your kindness. I was lost and now I'm not." Hazel offered him warm bread, still steaming. "Take it for your journey, and mind you keep to the path this time." At the oak, neighbors gathered. Bramwell grunted a farewell. Wren clapped him on the back. Clover pressed a jar of jam into his bag, and Tansy wrapped him in a shawl she swore she didn't need. For a moment, Hazel thought the stoat might waver, might choose to stay. But he only smiled, a little wistful. "I'll not forget Willowmere. If ever I pass this way again, you'll see me at your hearth." And with that, he set off along the lane, mist swallowing him by degrees until only the echo of his paw steps remained. The hollow lingered in silence. Then Wren, unable to bear the weight, said, "Well, that's that. Back to chores, I suppose." Hazel returned to her cottage, but her thoughts wandered. The hollow felt unchanged. Lanterns still glowed, the brook still sang, but something within her had shifted. A reminder that beyond their oak and meadows lay countless paths, countless lives, all touched by storms, kindness, and the simple sharing of bread. As she set her fresh loaf upon the table, Hazel thought, perhaps one day, the hollow itself would weave another stranger into its story. And when that day came, they would be ready, with tea on the stove and a chair by the fire. The hollow was quieter in the days after Lark's farewell, though daily life resumed. Hazel stitching by her window, Wren scampering about with endless schemes. There remained a faint hush, as if the lanes themselves remembered the stoat's tread. It was Bramwell who first noticed the trouble. One morning, carrying timber toward the mill, he frowned at the little bridge that crossed the brook. The storm had loosened its stones. The right-hand side sagged, dipping so that water lapped almost across its planks. "A few more rains," he muttered, "and it'll wash out entirely." By mid-morning, word had spread. Hazel came to look, her brow furrowed. Clover tooted at the sight. Wren, naturally, tested it by bouncing atop the planks. "Still holds," they declared, though the wobble sent Hazel's heart into her throat. It must be mended, Bramwell decided, or else no one will reach the mill without a soaking. So another workday began, neighbors gathering tools and rope. Bramwell oversaw. Hazel kept tally of nails. Clover fetched stones from the brookside, and Wren scampered to and fro with more energy than accuracy. The task was not simple. Each stone had to be reset in mud still softened from storms. Bramwell strained. Hazel steadied beams, and once, when Wren toppled headlong into the water, laughter rang despite weary arms. "I meant to fetch moss." Wren sputtered, dripping, and everyone knew they hadn't. By late afternoon, the bridge stood firmer, newly braced with timber, its stones reset in neat rows. Hazel tied the last rope and stepped back with a sigh of relief. The brook burbled beneath, as though approving. That evening, lanterns reflected in the water's surface, steady once more. Hazel thought of how easily small things could tilt out of order, and how quickly they were set right again when many paws worked together. As she crossed the mended bridge, she felt the hollow itself steadying, like a heartbeat returned to rhythm. With the bridge restored, attention returned to smaller matters. Tansy's bakery, sweetheart of the hollow, had suffered a shortage during the storm. Now, with flour once more arriving, she prepared loaves with renewed zeal. Hazel stopped by one morning to fetch bread. As she entered, she nearly collided with Wren, who was dusted head to tail in white powder. "Don't ask," they said grimly. But of course Hazel asked. It turned out that Tansy, needing help, had enlisted Wren to shift sacks of flour. The squirrel, ever restless, had thought to carry two at once. Halfway across the floor, one split, bursting open in a cloud so thick it turned the bakery into a winter scene. "I sneezed myself silly," Wren confessed, brushing at their fur, which only puffed up another cloud. "Tansy says I've wasted a week's worth of rolls." Tansy herself emerged, flour clinging to her whiskers, but good humor intact. "Not wasted, dear, just scattered. The sparrows are making quick work of it." Sure enough, outside the open window, a small flock pecked eagerly at the white drift. Hazel laughed despite herself, though she knelt to help sweep. Wren grumbled, but soon was laughing too, chasing sparrows from the door with exaggerated flaps. By the time the mess was cleared, the bakery smelled warm and sweet once more. Hazel bought 2 loaves and slipped one into Wren's paws. "For your troubles." That evening, as they shared bread by her hearth, Hazel mused aloud. Sometimes mistakes are just another way of feeding someone else. Wren, mouth full, only grinned. Autumn edged closer, cool breezes rustling through the hollow. Hazel lit her lantern earlier each night, its glow steady against the dark. Yet one evening she noticed the great oak's lantern swinging oddly, as though loosened by wind. "Another job," Bramble muttered when told. "These storms leave nothing untouched." But Hazel felt oddly protective of that particular lantern. It had always glowed like a watchful star, marking the heart of Willowmere. So she and Wren went together to tend it. They climbed the small ladder Bramble had left by the trunk. Wren steadied while Hazel untied knots, replacing the frayed cord with new. Up close, Hazel noticed the lantern's glass was cracked, a jagged line running from top to base. "One strong gust, and it'll shatter," she murmured. Wren bounded off and returned with a spare pane, clumsily wrapped in cloth. Together they fitted it. Hazel careful with each screw, Wren impatient but eager. When at last the lantern was whole again, Hazel lit it anew. The glow spread warmly, brighter than before, casting soft gold over the oak's roots. Hazel stepped back, brushing dust from her paws. "There," she said softly. Safe again. They lingered, watching moths dance around the light. Wren leaned against the trunk, thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder," they asked, "what strangers think, seeing our lantern from the road?" Hazel considered. Perhaps they think, here is a place where light waits, a place that would welcome them. Her mind flickered briefly to Lark. Wherever he walked now, she hoped he'd remember the hollow's lanterns, steady against any storm. The oak loomed above, strong and sheltering, the lantern's glow swaying gently. Hazel knew storms would come again. Bridges might tilt, flour might scatter, but the lantern would always be relit. The light returned, guiding each of them home. And in that quiet moment, beneath its golden shine, she felt the truth of the hollow, not unchanging, but ever mended, ever warmed by many small paws working together. Autumn's chill was beginning to nibble at the hollow. The evenings grew sharper, and Hazel found herself pulling her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Smoke from Bramble's chimney curled into the sky most mornings, and the scent of wood fire lingered pleasantly in the lanes. But one could not burn air, as Bramble often said, and firewood would not stack itself. So, when Hazel mentioned her dwindling pile, a plan was soon formed. The neighbors would gather wood together, sharing the labor so no hearth would go cold. They set out after breakfast, a merry band. Hazel with her stout basket, Bramble with his cart, Clover carrying a bundle of twine, and Wren bounding along with exaggerated strength, declaring themselves chief wood inspector. The woods beyond the meadow were thick with fallen branches after the storms, and it did not take long to find their task. Bramble lifted the heaviest logs, grunting but steady. Hazel collected smaller branches, sorting them by size for kindling and cooking fires. Clover tied bundles neatly, her paws deft as ever. Wren darted everywhere at once, dragging sticks twice their height and insisting each was essential. Too green, Bramble scolded when Wren dumped an armload before him. Needs a season to dry. But it's a fine shape. Wren protested. Think of the sculptures we could carve. Hazel laughed, brushing bark dust from her skirts. We're here for warmth, not art, Wren. Still, she let them keep one curious, twisted branch, which Wren declared would become a walking stick of unmatched dignity. By midday, their cart brimmed. Clover spread oat cakes on a flat stone, and they ate beneath a canopy of golden leaves, sunlight dappling their fur. Hazel sipped water from a flask, watching a squirrel, not Wren, but a wild cousin, scramble high above, gathering acorns. She felt a kinship in their parallel tasks, each preparing for the winter ahead in their own ways. The return journey was slower, the cart heavy. But when they reached the hollow, each neighbor took their share. Hazel stacked hers neatly against her wall. Bramble rolled logs into his cellar. Clover set aside kindling for her stove. Wren, of course, paraded about with their twisted branch, already imagining adventures it might lead them on. That evening, Hazel lit her first true autumn fire. The flames crackled merrily. The room warmed, and outside the wind sighed in the trees. She thought of the day's labor, many paws making light work, and felt secure. The winter could bring what it would. The hollow would meet it together. Not all days in autumn were calm. 2 mornings later, the hollow woke to a wind that whistled through every crack and crevice. Leaves tore free in great golden showers, scattering across lanes and roofs. Hazel's shutters rattled, her teapot trembled on the stove, and outside, Wren hooped with delight as they leapt into drifts of swirling leaves. It's a dance, they cried, fur ruffled in every direction. Hazel ventured out cautiously, clutching her shawl. The air smelled sharp, full of motion. She found Clover battling her washing line, sheets snapping like sails. If this wind doesn't stop, I'll lose half my laundry, Clover shouted, clinging to a peg with grim determination. Hazel helped pin down what they could, though one sock was claimed by the breeze, vanishing skyward like a bird. Further along, Bramble was securing his shed roof, muttering at every gust. Hazel steadied the ladder as he hammered. Wren skipped by, carrying the runaway sock on a stick like a flag, singing a nonsense song about the mighty army of the breeze. The wind played tricks all day. Tansy's flower barrel toppled, dusting her porch white. A lantern clattered down by the brook, though fortunately unbroken. Even Hazel's neat woodpile was scattered, sticks rolling across her lane. She chased them with a resigned sigh, hair in her eyes, while Wren helpfully darted about catching what they could. By evening, the hollow was weary but unharmed. The wind softened as the sun set, leaving only a hush and a carpet of leaves glowing orange under lantern light. Hazel swept her path, though Wren insisted the leaves were better left for decoration. Later, as Hazel sat by her fire, she thought of how the hollow bent beneath the day's mischief, yet never broke. The wind might howl, but shutters were fastened, roofs patched, lanterns rehung. And in the morning, she knew they would wake to a calmer world, tidied once more by many patient paws. When the wind passed, the forest seemed to sigh in relief, and Clover announced it was time to visit her mushroom patch. Hazel and Wren gladly joined, The idea of wandering through damp earth and mossy shade after such bluster was soothing. The northern path, freshly cleared weeks before, welcomed them easily. Sunlight dappled the lane, and the air was rich with the scent of earth still damp from rain. Clover led with confident steps, basket on her arm, eyes sharp for the shapes she knew so well. "There!" she exclaimed, kneeling by a fallen log. Hazel bent too, marveling at the cluster of brown-capped mushrooms sprouting like little umbrellas. Clover plucked them carefully, humming with satisfaction. Perfect for stew. Wren, meanwhile, darted about with far less skill, presenting every toadstool they found with dramatic flair. "This one? A prize, surely. Poison," Clover said calmly, turning it aside. "And this? Bitter as bark." Hazel stifled her laughter as Wren grew more theatrical with each wrong guess, clutching their chest and declaring they were mortally wounded by rejection. Still, Clover's basket filled steadily with safe, plump mushrooms. At one patch, Clover beckoned Hazel closer. Nestled in moss grew a ring of delicate white caps, glimmering faintly in the shade. "Field mushrooms," Clover explained. "Rare here. A gift." Hazel touched one gently, marveling at its simple beauty. By afternoon, their baskets were full. They paused at the brook to wash their paws, water cool and clear. Wren balanced on stones, pretending to be a bridge keeper demanding tolls, until Hazel splashed them with a laugh. Back at Clover's, the harvest was laid out in tidy rows. The air filled with the savory scent of stew as she stirred mushrooms into her pot, adding onions and herbs. Hazel helped set the table. Wren sliced bread, though unevenly, and Bramble soon arrived, drawn by the smell. They ate together, bowls steaming, lantern light flickering. Hazel savored each bite, rich and earthy, warmed by laughter around the table. She thought of how simple tasks, gathering wood, steadying roofs, plucking mushrooms, wove into meals and moments shared. Outside, autumn deepened, leaves drifting down in quiet showers. But within Clover's kitchen, all was bright, full, and secure. And Hazel, glancing at her friends, felt again the truth she had learned with every season, that the hollow was not merely a place, but a hearth made of many hands, each one keeping the others warm. The end. Thank you for wandering through the woodland with us today. If you enjoyed your visit to Old Fernwood, don't forget to leave a like, share this tale with a friend, and subscribe for more cozy stories. Until next time, may your days be calm, your hearth warm, and your heart light.